Pretend to be my wife for 10 days. When the millionaire begged the innocent young woman with these words, she could never have imagined the real reason behind this strange request. The secret he was hiding surprised everyone. Tell me, where are you watching from? And if you stay to discover this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Let's go. The aroma of freshly baked pastries filled the small bakery nestled in Greenwich Village. Emily wiped her flour-covered hands on her worn apron as she watched the golden morning light filter through the shop window. It was in these quiet moments, before the first customers arrived, that she allowed herself to dream of a different life. A life where every penny wasn't counted to pay for her grandmother's medications. A life where possibilities extended beyond the four walls of this family business she had taken over out of duty rather than passion. The most meaningful encounters often happen when we've stopped waiting for miracles, she thought, as she rearranged the pastries in the display case. The bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of an early customer. Emily looked up, ready to serve with her usual smile. But the man who stood before her was no ordinary customer. Tall, elegant in his tailored suit, he seemed out of place in this modest setting. His grey eyes, with a troubling intensity, scanned the space as if evaluating a potential investment. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" asked Emily, unsettled despite herself by this stranger's imposing presence. "An espresso, please," he replied in a deep voice, marked by the confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders. As she prepared his order, Emily felt the man's gaze upon her. When she handed him his cup, their fingers brushed. A brief contact, but one that seemed to electrify the atmosphere. "Miss," he began after taking a sip, "I have a proposition for you." Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The proposal that followed was so unexpected, so extravagant, that she initially thought it was a joke. "I need you to pretend to be my wife for 10 days. I'll pay you $50,000. The silence that followed was charged with disbelief. Outside, New York life bustled on, indifferent to this moment that would forever change two destinies. For in the most absurd proposals sometimes hide the most transformative opportunities, and that morning, under the changeable sky of New York, Emily stood at the threshold of a choice that would upend all her certainties. James Wilson, CEO of Wilson Investments, was not a man accustomed to begging. Used to having the world bend to his fortune and influence, he now found himself in this modest bakery, formulating a request that stripped him of all his dignity. "My mother is celebrating her 75th birthday in 10 days, he explained to Emily, who listened with growing mistrust. I lied a few months ago. I told her I was engaged to make her happy." "And your imaginary fiancé vanished?" asked Emily, with a boldness that surprised even herself. A bitter smile crossed James's face. "She never existed. But now my entire family is arriving from across the country. My mother has organized a celebration that will last several days, and I can't confess that I invented this relationship." Emily observed the man before her. Beneath the veneer of confidence, she perceived an unexpected vulnerability. His eyes betrayed a fatigue that wasn't merely physical. "Why me?" she asked softly. James hesitated. "I've been watching you for a few days. You are authentic. My mother would immediately sense if I hired a professional actress. She has a sixth sense for these things." Emily felt herself blushing. The idea that he had been observing her troubled her as much as it flattered her. $50,000, she repeated, pronouncing this sum that represented more money than she had ever possessed. 10 days, James confirmed. "You'll only have to play the role of a loving fiancé. We'll have a week to prepare your character." Emily thought of her grandmother Margaret, whose medications cost more each month, of the bakery, whose oven was showing signs of wear, of her own life, put on hold for so long that she had almost forgotten her dreams. "All right," she finally said with a sigh, "I accept your proposal." James's face relaxed briefly before resuming his mask of professional efficiency. "Perfect. We'll start tomorrow. Be ready at 7. And so, in the softness of a New York morning, Emily Parker, a young baker from Greenwich Village, agreed to become for 10 days the fictitious fiancée of one of the most influential businessmen in America, unaware of how this contract would transform her existence. No, no, and no. A woman from high society doesn't carry herself like that. Sarah Wilson's voice, James's younger sister, resonated in the spacious Upper East Side apartment. Emily, dressed in a cocktail dress whose price could have covered a month's rent, stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room. "I'm not a high society woman," retorted Emily, her patience wearing thin after 3 hours of what she considered torture. Sarah, a formidable lawyer and inveterate perfectionist, had been let in on the secret out of necessity. Unlike James, she made no effort to hide her skepticism about this charade. "That's precisely the problem," she sighed while adjusting Emily's posture. "My mother will never believe that my brother, who has only dated heiresses and diplomats, has fallen in love with a baker." The word had been pronounced with a slight condescension that didn't escape Emily. She straightened up, a spark of pride illuminating her gaze. "I may be a baker, but I know the value of honest work and authenticity, qualities that seem rare in your world." A tense silence settled. James, who had been observing the scene from the threshold, finally intervened. "Enough, Sarah. Emily doesn't need to become someone else. It's precisely her simplicity that convinced me to offer her this role." Sarah rolled her eyes but didn't insist. She left the room muttering something about a disaster waiting to happen. Left alone with Emily, James approached her, a glass of wine in hand. "Please excuse my sister. She's protective. She's mostly afraid that I won't measure up and that I'll embarrass you," Emily responded, accepting the glass he offered. James observed her for a moment, seeming to truly see her for the first time. "You know, it's this frankness that's sorely lacking in my circles. Everyone walks on eggshells, calculating every word. It's refreshing." Their gazes met, and for the first time since the beginning of this strange collaboration, a form of complicity was established between them. "Tell me about your mother," asked Emily, settling into an armchair. "If I'm to convince her that I'm madly in love with her son, I might as well understand her." James sat across from her, and over the following hours, he told her about Elizabeth Wilson, widowed at 30, who had taken the reins of the family business and transformed it into an empire. He evoked her inflexible character, her attachment to traditions, but also her hidden generosity and her unconditional love for her children. "She lived only to give us what she never had," he concluded with a tenderness that surprised Emily. "Now she wants grandchildren, a daughter-in-law who will carry on the family traditions." "And what do you want?" Emily gently asked. The question seemed to disconcert James. He stared at his glass as if the answer might be found there. "I want my mother to be happy," he finally said. Emily didn't press, but she had perceived the hesitation, the crack in the armor of this man who seemed to have everything, except perhaps the ability to define himself outside of his family's expectations. That night, lying in the luxurious guest room assigned to her, Emily contemplated the ornate ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of New York. In accepting this role, she had thought only of the money, of the security it would provide for her grandmother. She hadn't anticipated that she would enter a world far more complex than her own, a universe of perfect facades, concealing deep fractures. The Wilson family mansion, nestled in the Hamptons, imposed with its austere splendor. Emily, stepping out of the car that had driven her from James's apartment, felt her heart quicken. The 3 days of preparation had not been enough to prepare her for the intimidating reality of this home where Elizabeth Wilson resided. "Remember," James murmured, taking her arm, "we met 8 months ago at a charity event." "I know," Emily replied, nervously clutching her borrowed handbag. "I prepared pastries for the auction benefiting the Children's Foundation. And I was charmed by your modesty and talent," James completed with a smile that for the first time reached his eyes. The door opened before they even reached the porch, revealing an elderly woman whose regal bearing and piercing gaze left no doubt as to her identity. "My son," said Elizabeth Wilson, embracing James with all the reserve of the aristocracy before turning her attention to Emily. "And you must be the one who accomplished the impossible by capturing the heart of my elusive heir." Emily stepped forward, drawing on all her confidence to meet the evaluative gaze of this woman who embodied a world so far from her own. "Mrs. Wilson, it's an honor to finally meet you. James has told me so much about you." An imperceptible smile touched the matriarch's lips. "Come in. Tea is served in the small parlor." The hours that followed were a trial for Emily. Each of Elizabeth's questions seemed to conceal a trap. How had they really met? What was her family like, her aspirations? Under James's watchful eye, Emily navigated this minefield With a sincerity that wasn't feigned, she lied about the circumstances, but not about who she fundamentally was. "I find it admirable that you took over the family business at such a young age," Elizabeth commented, after Emily had mentioned the bakery. "Loyalty to one's roots is a quality I particularly value." "It was natural," Emily replied, touched despite herself by this unexpected approval. "My grandmother gave me everything. Giving back to her is only justice." Something then changed in Elizabeth's gaze. A glimmer of authentic interest, perhaps even respect. The dinner that followed brought together several members of the Wilson family who had arrived from across the country for the upcoming festivities. Emily was introduced as James's fiancée, and each handshake, each superficial conversation, added a layer to this lie that was coming to life around them. It was during this dinner that the first real obstacle arose. Robert Wilson, James's cousin and partner in the family business, turned out to personally know the pastry chef who had supposedly employed Emily during the charity event where she allegedly met James. "Strange," said Robert, frowning. "Peter never mentioned an Emily among his assistants that evening." A heavy silence fell over the table. Emily felt panic rising within her, while Sarah's gaze, at the other end of the table, darkened with an unspoken, "I told you so." It was James who intervened, with a naturalness that surprised even Emily. "Emily was volunteering that evening, Robert. She wasn't officially employed by Peter. It's precisely this selfless gesture that impressed me so much." Robert seemed to accept this explanation, but Emily understood that their lie was more fragile than she had imagined. In this world where everyone knew everyone, where family and professional ties had been interwoven for generations, their fiction risked exposure at any moment. Later that evening, as the guests retired one by one, Emily found herself alone in the garden behind the mansion. The coolness of the New York night soothed her nerves, tense from this day of continuous performance. "You did well," said James's voice behind her. Emily turned, observing this man who seemed both so familiar and so foreign to her. "It was less difficult than expected," she admitted. "Your mother is intimidating, but not as terrifying as your sister led me to believe." James approached, offering her his suit jacket, which she accepted gratefully. "My mother has always known how to see beyond appearances. That's why I knew she wouldn't be fooled if I hired a professional actress." "And you think she's convinced by our story?" asked Emily, wrapped in the subtle scent of the jacket, a mixture of sandalwood and something uniquely James. "I think she wants to believe it," he answered softly. "Like all of us, she looks for reasons to hope." These words resonated with Emily in a way she hadn't anticipated. Under the starry sky of New York, in the garden of a family that wasn't hers, she began to glimpse the true stakes of this charade, far beyond the $50,000 promised. On the third day of this carefully orchestrated comedy, the edifice of lies began to waver. Emily, sitting in the library of the Wilson mansion, was absent-mindedly leafing through an ancient book when her phone vibrated. The message from her grandmother, Margaret, froze her blood. "Emergency. Doctor wants to hospitalize me. Need you." With trembling hands, Emily immediately dialed her grandmother's number. The conversation that followed confirmed her worst fears. Margaret's condition had suddenly deteriorated. A costly but necessary surgical procedure was recommended as soon as possible. "How much?" asked Emily, her throat tight. $45,000, replied her grandmother's tired voice. "Insurance only covers a minimal part." "I'm sorry, dear." The sum echoed as a cruel reminder of what James had promised her. $45,000, almost exactly what would remain from the $50,000 once the bakery's debts were repaid. "Don't worry," Emily assured, gathering all her conviction. "I have a solution. Rest. I'll take care of everything." Hanging up, Emily realized she faced a heart-wrenching dilemma. The 10 days hadn't yet elapsed. James would only pay her the sum at the end of their arrangement. But Margaret needed that money now. Lost in thought, she didn't hear Sarah enter the library. "Trouble in paradise?" asked James's sister with a touch of irony. Emily quickly wiped away the tears that threatened to fall. "Nothing that concerns you." Sarah approached, her usually hard expression giving way to an almost benevolent curiosity. "You know, I never understood why my brother chose this absurd stratagem rather than simply admitting the truth to our mother." "Perhaps because he loves her too much to disappoint her," Emily responded, surprised by her own defense of James. Or perhaps because he's a coward, retorted Sarah, sitting across from Emily. James has always chosen emotional ease. Committing to a real relationship would mean risking being hurt. Emily observed this woman, whom she had initially perceived as an adversary. For the first time, she glimpsed the complexity of relationships within the Wilson family. You seem to know him well, she said softly. He's my brother, Sarah replied simply. I love him despite all his flaws. That's why I hate seeing him hide behind facades. A silence settled between the two women, charged with a new understanding. Your grandmother is ill, isn't she? Sarah suddenly asked. Emily looked at her, stunned. How? I researched you, Sarah admitted without beating around the bush. Lawyer by profession, paranoid by nature. Emily Parker, granddaughter of Margaret Parker, baker in Greenwich Village, living alone with her grandmother since her parents died in a car accident 15 years ago. Once the shock passed, Emily felt a cold anger rising within her. By what right did you dig into my life? By the right of someone who protects her family, Sarah replied unflinchingly. But what I discovered surprised me. You're not what I imagined. Before Emily could respond, the library door opened again, revealing James. He stopped short, sensing the tension in the air. What's going on here? Sarah rose gracefully. Just a conversation between future sisters-in-law, she said before leaving the room, leaving James and Emily face to face. Emily rose as well, making a decision that would change the course of their arrangement. I need to talk to you, she said firmly. I need the money now. My grandmother must undergo urgent surgery. James looked at her for a long time, his face unreadable. I understand, he finally said. How much do you need? $45,000. Without hesitation, James took out his phone and made an immediate transfer under Emily's astonished eyes. Why? She murmured, unable to comprehend this gesture that went far beyond their contract. James put away his phone, avoiding her gaze. Maybe I'm not the man you think, Emily, nor the one my family believes they know. This phrase, uttered almost in a whisper, contained a truth that Emily was only beginning to glimpse. Behind the mask of the ruthless businessman hid a man in search of authenticity, just as she was in search of security. I need to return to my grandmother, Emily announced, aware that this precipitous departure risked compromising their plan. To her great surprise, James nodded without protest. I'll accompany you. That's not necessary. If we want our story to remain credible, a fiancé would never let his future wife face such an ordeal alone. This reasoning was logical, but Emily sensed there was more to it. Something had changed between them, a form of mutual respect that transcended their commercial arrangement. Thus, at the twilight of this third day, James Wilson, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in America, found himself in a modest hospital room in the East Village, holding Margaret Parker's hand while Emily discussed with the doctors. That evening, certainties collapsed on both sides. For in choosing to accompany Emily, James had crossed an invisible line, the one separating contract from authentic engagement. Mount Sinai Hospital was bathed in the bluish light of early morning when Emily emerged from her torpor. She had spent the night in an uncomfortable armchair near her grandmother's bed, who now slept peacefully after receiving assurance that her operation would be scheduled in the coming days. What surprised Emily was discovering James still present. He hadn't left the hospital. Seated in the hallway, his wrinkled suit and drawn features testified to a sleepless night. You stayed, she noted as she approached, offering him a coffee from the machine she had just purchased. I told you a fiancé wouldn't leave, he replied, accepting the cup gratefully. But Emily was no longer fooled by this convenient explanation. You didn't have to do this. No one from your family is here to judge your performance. James took a sip of coffee, grimacing at its bitter taste. Perhaps I wasn't playing a role. This admission, subtle as it was, created a charged silence between them. Emily sat beside him, aware of a new intimacy that had nothing to do with their contract. Tell me about yourself, she asked softly. The real James, not the one you show to the world. He hesitated, seeming to weigh the pros and cons of such a confidence. I'm not sure I know this real James myself, he finally admitted. For as long as I can remember, I've been what others expected of me. The prodigious son, the perfect heir, the ruthless businessman. And what would you have wanted to be? The question seemed to disconcert him. He stared at the tiled floor, as if searching for an answer there. An architect, he said so quietly that Emily almost didn't hear him. I would have wanted to create spaces that bring people together, not investment portfolios that divide them. This unexpected confession touched Emily more than she would have imagined. She glimpsed for the first time the man behind the facade, with his abandoned dreams and silent regrets. It's never too late, she offered gently. A sad smile passed over James's face. For some choices, it is. Before Emily could respond, her phone vibrated. It was a message from Sarah, brief and alarming. Mother asking questions, delicate situation, come back soon. Emily showed the message to James, who immediately stood up. We have to return. My mother has a sixth sense for detecting lies. If she starts to doubt... I can't leave, Margaret, Emily protested, torn between her obligations to her grandmother and their agreement. James approached the half-open door of the room, observing the elderly woman who slept. She's in good hands here, he said with surprising kindness. I'll personally ensure that the best specialists take care of her. You don't have to do that. I want to, he affirmed, with a conviction that rendered any argument futile. The return journey to the Wilson mansion was silent, each absorbed in their thoughts. For Emily, the situation was becoming increasingly complex. What had begun as a simple financial agreement was transforming into something she struggled to define. As for James, he seemed to be fighting against feelings he hadn't anticipated. Upon their arrival at the mansion, they were greeted by a visibly relieved Elizabeth. My God, I was worried sick, disappearing like that without warning. I'm sorry, Mother, James apologized. Emily's grandmother had an urgent health issue. Elizabeth's severe face immediately softened. She took Emily's hands in hers, a maternal gesture that Emily hadn't known since the death of her own mother. My poor child, why didn't you say anything? Family is there to support each other in difficult times. Family. This word resonated strangely in Emily's ears. In just a few days, she had found herself integrated into this concept, even if everything rested on a lie. Later in the day, as preparations for Elizabeth's grand birthday celebration were in full swing, Sarah took Emily aside. I know you were at the hospital, she said without preamble. I covered for your absence by pretending you two had gone to visit a venue for your wedding reception. Emily looked at her with surprise. Why would you help me? Sarah sighed, her mask of coldness cracking slightly. Because I've never seen my brother behave the way he does with you. Something has changed in him. We're just playing our roles, Emily weakly protested. No, Sarah replied, with quiet certainty. My brother isn't acting anymore. And I don't think you are either. These words resonated with Emily like a truth she wasn't yet ready to admit. For acknowledging her nascent feelings for James would mean accepting that this fiction might become a form of reality, with all the complications that would entail. That evening, during the family dinner, Emily observed James interacting with his relatives. She noticed details that had escaped her before, the way he discreetly supported his mother when she rose, the patience with which he listened to a great-uncle's repeated stories, the hidden tenderness behind his teasing of Sarah, and when their gazes met across the table, something genuine passed between them, a mutual recognition of revealed truths that made their charade increasingly difficult to maintain. For the real danger was no longer that their lie might be discovered, but that their hearts might reveal a truth that neither had anticipated. On the sixth day of their arrangement, New York awoke under a fine rain that enveloped the city in a melancholic veil. Emily, standing by the window of her room at the Wilson mansion, watched the droplets trace sinuous paths on the glass. Like these raindrops, her life seemed to have taken an unpredictable direction, merging with other currents she never imagined crossing. A discreet knock at her door drew her from her contemplation. It was Elizabeth, elegant despite the early hour, standing at the threshold. "May I come in, dear?" she asked with a gentleness that contrasted with her usual authority. Emily nodded, surprised by this unexpected visit. "I'd like to show you something," Elizabeth announced as she entered the room. She held a leather-bound photo album. "The preparations for the party make me nostalgic. I thought you might like to know a bit more about the family that will soon be yours." Emily felt a pang of guilt at these words, but composed a smile. They sat side by side on the small sofa near the window, and Elizabeth opened the album on her knees. "Here's James at 8, she said, pointing to a small boy with a shy smile holding a model building. He spent hours constructing structures with whatever he could get his hands on. His father was convinced he would become an architect. Emily looked at the photo with emotion, recognizing in the child's eyes the same passion that James had confessed to her at the hospital. "What happened?" she asked softly. Elizabeth's face darkened. "Life. My husband's death. The necessity of preserving the family legacy." James took responsibilities on his shoulders that shouldn't have been his, so young. The pages turned, revealing the story of a family marked by expectations and sacrifices. Emily discovered a teenage James, his gaze already more serious, alongside a child Sarah who looked at him with adoration. Photos of graduation ceremonies, official events, handshakes with influential figures, tracing the ascension of a man shaped by duty. "He never faltered," Elizabeth murmured with a mixture of pride and regret. Not once did he complain about the path destiny had traced for him. Emily now understood better the man James had become and why he had chosen this desperate solution rather than disappointing the woman seated beside her. "You know," Elizabeth continued as she closed the album, "when James told me he had met someone, I initially thought it was a joke. My son has always placed duty before his own desires. Seeing him finally choose his happiness, that's the most beautiful gift a mother could receive." Each of Elizabeth's words was like an arrow piercing Emily's heart. The guilt of the lie became almost unbearable in the face of this sincere trust. "Mrs. Wilson." "Elizabeth, please. We're almost family now." Emily took a deep breath, on the verge of a confession that could destroy everything. But before she could speak, the door opened to reveal James, who stopped short seeing the two women together. "What are you two plotting?" he asked, trying to mask his nervousness under a light tone. "Women's secrets," Elizabeth replied, with a conspiratorial wink to Emily before rising. "I'll leave you. I still have 1,000 details to arrange for the party." Once Elizabeth had left, James approached Emily, noticing the photo album and her troubled expression. "Is everything all right?" "No," Emily honestly replied. "I can't continue like this, James. Your mother trusts me. She shares precious memories with me, hopes for the future. Each of her sincere words makes our lie more cruel." James sat in the place his mother had just vacated, his face reflecting the same torment. "I know. I feel the same way." A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken words and unexplored possibilities. "I called the hospital," James finally said. "Your grandmother will be operated on tomorrow. The best surgeons will take care of her." "Thank you," Emily murmured, touched by this attention that went far beyond their agreement. "I'll accompany you," he added, "if you wish." Their gazes met, and in this silent connection something was transforming, their contractual arrangement giving way to a deeper, more authentic form of alliance. "James," Emily began, gathering her courage, "what if we—" She was interrupted by Sarah's precipitous arrival, her face grave. "We have a problem," she announced without preamble. "Robert has done some research. He knows Emily wasn't at the charity sale. He intends to reveal everything to Mother tonight during the family dinner." James rose abruptly, his face suddenly pale. "How did he discover—" "It doesn't matter," Sarah cut in. "What matters is what we're going to do now." Emily observed them both, these Wilson siblings united in adversity despite their differences. She then made a decision that would change the course of their story. "I'll confess everything to your mother," she declared with quiet determination, "before Robert does." "No," exclaimed James, "it would break her." "What will break her is learning it from someone else," Emily replied. "If I explain myself with sincerity, perhaps she'll understand." Sarah looked at Emily with new respect. "She's right, James. Mother detests being manipulated above all else, but she knows how to forgive honesty." James seemed torn, caught at a crossroads of impossible choices. Emily approached him, taking his hands in hers. "Sometimes truth is the only possible path, even if it hurts in the moment." Their gazes locked, and in this moment of shared vulnerability, something stronger than their initial arrangement crystallized between them. A trust born of adversity, a bond forged in trial. "All right," James finally yielded. "We'll speak to her together, tonight before dinner." This choice, made together, marked a decisive turning point. They were no longer simply bound by a contract, but by a common decision to face the consequences of their charade. Together. As the rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows of the Wilson mansion, Emily and James prepared for a far more personal storm. For tonight, the masks would fall, and with them perhaps the possibility of a future that neither had dared to imagine. The blue parlor of the Wilson mansion, with its ancient wood panels and period tapestries, had witnessed many conversations that had shaped the family's destiny. That evening, as the lights of New York began to twinkle in the twilight, it hosted a discussion that could well change the lives of all its participants. Elizabeth Wilson, seated in her favorite armchair, observed with growing perplexity her son, his supposed fiancée, and her daughter, all three standing before her like children caught in wrongdoing. "You asked to see me privately," she finally said, breaking a silence that had become unbearable. "I'm listening." James took a step forward, then stopped, words seeming to escape him. Emily sensed his distress and, in an instinctive gesture of support, brushed his hand with hers. This simple contact seemed to give him the necessary strength. "Mother," he began, his voice less assured than usual, "we have something to confess to you." Elizabeth imperceptibly stiffened, her keen eyes going from one to the other. "I lied to you," James continued. "Emily and we're not engaged." "Not really." Elizabeth's face remained impassive, but her hands clenched on the armrests of her chair. "Continue," she said simply. James then explained everything. His panic at the prospect of disappointing his mother, the initial lie about imaginary engagement, then the desperate plan to find someone to play this role during the celebrations. "I hired Emily," he concluded, shame transparent in every syllable. "She accepted because she needed money for her grandmother's operation." A heavy silence followed this confession. Elizabeth no longer looked at her son, but at Emily, her gaze unreadable. "And you, miss," she finally said, "what do you have to say?" Emily felt the weight of this gaze that seemed to see beyond appearances, to the very heart of her intentions. "I accepted out of necessity," she admitted, her voice trembling but determined. "My grandmother is all I have left, and I would do anything to save her. But," she hesitated, searching for the right words, "but these last few days have been much more than I expected. I discovered a family traditions, a way of being together that touched me deeply." Emily then dared to raise her eyes to Elizabeth. "I came here thinking I would play a role, but I ended up revealing myself more sincerely than I have in years. The context was false, but what I shared with you, my hopes, my dreams, my values, all of that was true." A silent tear ran down Emily's cheek, which she wiped away with a quick gesture. "I'm sorry for deceiving you. You deserved better than this lie." Elizabeth rose slowly, her face still unreadable. She approached the window, contemplating New York as it progressively lit up. "Sarah," she said without turning around, "you knew?" "Yes, Mother," replied Sarah, who had remained in the background. "I discovered the truth and initially wanted to reveal everything. But then, Elizabeth encouraged. "Then I saw how they looked at each other," Sarah completed with unusual gentleness. "And I understood that something real was being born, beyond their initial arrangement." Elizabeth finally turned, her gaze passing from James to Emily. "Is it true?" she asked, addressing her son. "Is there something real?" James seemed taken aback by this direct question. He looked at Emily, and in that gaze she read a vulnerability, a confusion, and a tenderness that no actor in the world could have simulated. "I don't know what's real or not," he admitted with disarming honesty. "I only know that since Emily entered my life, everything seems different, as if I had been asleep for years and was finally beginning to wake up." Elizabeth observed her son carefully, then turned her gaze toward Emily. "And you, Emily? What do you truly feel for my son?" The question, posed with a frankness that allowed no escape, placed Emily face to face with feelings she herself was just beginning to understand. "I think that," she began before stopping, searching for the right words, "James is the most complex, most contradictory, and most interesting man I've ever met. Each day spent by his side has revealed a new facet of him, and of myself." She took a deep breath before continuing. "I don't know if it's love. I only know that when I think about the end of these 10 days, about returning to my life before without him, I feel an emptiness that I've never experienced before." The sincerity of this confession seemed to touch Elizabeth. Her face softened, and an almost imperceptible smile formed on her lips. "You know," she said as she returned to her seat, When I married James's father, it was an arranged marriage by our families. Love came later, nurtured by mutual respect and trials faced together. She motioned for James and Emily to sit across from her. I should be furious. You lied to me, manipulated me. But strangely, I feel rather grateful. This declaration surprised everyone in the room. Grateful? Repeated James, incredulous. Yes, Elizabeth confirmed, because this lie may have been the catalyst you needed, my son. Since your father's death, I've watched you close yourself off, place barriers between yourself and your own feelings. For the first time in years, I see you vulnerable, authentic, alive. She turned to Emily. As for you, young woman, I believe you have brought into this house something it sorely lacked. Spontaneity, frankness, and a reminder that life consists of much more than obligations and conventions. A stunned silence greeted these words. Sarah, James, and Emily exchanged astonished glances. So, you're not angry? James dared to ask. Oh, yes, Elizabeth replied with a dry laugh. I'm furious that you thought it necessary to mount such a charade, rather than simply telling me the truth. But anger is a luxury I can no longer afford at my age. She rose, signaling that the interview was coming to an end. Dinner will be served in an hour. Until then, I'd like you both to reflect on what you truly want. Not what you believe you should do, not what you think others expect of you, but what your hearts truly desire. Before leaving the room, she turned to them one last time. Robert will be present tonight. I suppose he intended to expose your little secret for all to see. I'll handle talking to him. When the door closed behind Elizabeth, an astonished silence reigned in the blue parlor. Sarah was the first to break it. Well, she said with an incredulous smile, that was unexpected. James still seemed in shock, as if the ground had just crumbled beneath his feet. She knew, he murmured. She may have known from the beginning. Emily, for her part, felt a troubling mixture of relief and anguish. The lie had been revealed, but a far more terrifying question now arose. What remained between James and her, now that their arrangement no longer had reason to exist? This question, suspended between them like an invisible thread, would soon demand an answer that neither was yet ready to formulate. The hospital room was bathed in a soft light, filtered by half-lowered blinds. Margaret Parker, still pale but with a lively gaze, observed with curiosity the elegant man who stood beside her granddaughter. James Wilson, this name she had only heard in Emily's hasty confidences, now had a face. And what a face! He strangely resembled the yellowed photographs that Margaret carefully preserved in a box under her bed. So you're the famous businessman who hired my granddaughter for a romantic comedy, she said, without beating around the bush, her frankness intact, despite her recent operation. James, caught off guard by this direct attack, cast an uncertain glance at Emily, who shrugged with an apologetic smile. Grandma knows everything, she confirmed. I couldn't lie to her. Indeed, it's me, admitted James, stepping forward to shake the elderly woman's hand, and I want to apologize for involving your granddaughter in this unconventional situation. Margaret studied him at length, her narrowed eyes seeming to read him like an open book. Sit down, young man, she finally ordered, patting the edge of her bed. I'd like to know the man who has disrupted my Emily's well-ordered life. During the hour that followed, Margaret questioned James about his family, his work, his aspirations, with an acuity that strangely recalled Elizabeth Wilson's interrogations. Emily observed this exchange with a mixture of amusement and concern, surprised to see James respond with an honesty she didn't yet know in him. Architect, repeated Margaret, when James evoked his abandoned dream. Interesting. Emily too should have followed another path, you know. Grandma, Emily intervened, uncomfortable. What? It's the truth, Margaret insisted. My granddaughter had a remarkable talent for writing. Her teachers said she could have become a journalist, perhaps even a writer. But when her parents died and the bakery risked closing, I did what was necessary, Emily softly completed. And I don't regret it. James looked at Emily as if discovering her in a new light. Hao never told me about this, he said. We had a professional agreement, Emily replied with a slight shrug. My personal life wasn't part of it. An awkward silence settled, which Margaret broke with the subtlety of a bulldozer. So, now that your little arrangement is coming to an end, what are your intentions, Mr. Wilson? Grandma, exclaimed Emily, mortified. What? It's a legitimate question, Margaret defended. "This man dragged you into a charade, met your only family, paid for my operation. I have the right to know if he intends to disappear from your life as suddenly as he entered it." James, far from being offended, seemed to consider the question with the utmost seriousness. "I'm not sure it's for me to decide," he finally replied, his gaze seeking Emily's. "Much will depend on what your granddaughter wishes." Margaret let out a small laugh that transformed into a light cough. "Men," she sighed once recovered, "always waiting for women to make the difficult decisions for them." She turned to the small table near her bed and pointed to a drawer. "Emily, dear, could you give me the blue box in there?" Emily complied, intrigued. Margaret opened the box adorned with silver arabesques and took out a black and white photograph which she handed to James. "Look," she said simply. The photo showed a young man in military uniform with a charming smile posing proudly in front of a New York building. "That's—" James began, frowning. "Your grandfather, William Wilson," Margaret confirmed, carefully observing his reaction. "I recognize him despite the years. You have his smile and that same way of narrowing your eyes when you're thinking." Emily looked alternately at her grandmother and James, astonished. "How do you know his grandfather?" Margaret caressed the photo with tenderness, as one caresses a precious memory. "New York, 1955. I was 18, working in a bookstore near Washington Square. William had just entered architecture school, his dream. He spent hours leafing through books on Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright." She paused, lost in her memories. "We lived an intense love story for 6 months. Then his family discovered our relationship. I was a simple salesgirl, daughter of workers, not the kind of woman they envisioned for their heir." James listened, amazed by this unexpected revelation. "Grandfather abandoned architecture to take over the family business shortly after," he murmured. "He married my grandmother from an influential family. I never knew there had been someone else." "Families like yours know how to bury their secrets," said Margaret without bitterness. "I'm not telling you this to stir up the past, but to show you how history can repeat itself if one isn't careful." She took James's hand in hers, a gesture both maternal and solemn. "Don't make the same mistake as your grandfather. Don't let others' expectations define your life, and above all," her gaze fell on Emily, full of infinite love, "don't miss out on true love out of fear or duty." This revelation created an unexpected bond between them, as if destiny had woven an invisible web uniting their family stories. Leaving the hospital that day, James and Emily walked in silence through the New York streets, each absorbed in their thoughts. "Do you believe in destiny?" James finally asked, breaking the silence as they crossed Brooklyn Bridge. Emily stopped in the middle of the bridge, contemplating the East River sparkling under the setting sun. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but I believe in choices. Every decision we make opens a path and closes others." "And which path would you choose now, Emily?" asked James, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the river. "Now that our agreement is coming to an end, now that the lie has been revealed," the question hung between them, charged with unexpressed possibilities. Emily looked at this man whom she had initially considered a simple employer, then a partner in a charade, and who had become— what exactly? Before she could answer, James's phone rang, interrupting the intimate moment. He answered reluctantly, his face transforming into a professional mask as the conversation progressed. When he hung up, his expression was grave. "That was Sarah. The main investor in our new project threatens to withdraw if I don't return to the office immediately to resolve a crisis." Emily nodded, understanding that reality was catching up with them. "Go. Your mother invited me to help with the final preparations for the party. I'll see you at the mansion." James hesitated, as if he wanted to say something important, but time was pressing. He briefly squeezed Emily's hand, a gesture that seemed sadly formal after the intimacy they had shared. "See you tonight," he said, before quickly walking away, hailing a taxi. Emily remained a moment on the bridge, watching James's silhouette disappear into the New York traffic. Her grandmother's revelations echoed in her mind, creating a troubling parallel with her own situation. The Wilsons and the Parkers, two families that everything seemed to separate, united by an invisible thread woven across generations. As she resumed her walk toward the Wilson mansion, Emily felt that the real trials were only beginning. For now that the masks had fallen, they had to face the most formidable question of all: what remained when the game ended? The golden light of the setting sun bathed James's office in an almost unreal glow, contrasting with the tension reigning in the room. Facing him, Richard Marshall, the main investor in the Hamptons Shore project, fixed him with a calculating coldness. "Let me summarize the situation, Wilson," said Marshall, drumming on the armrest of his chair. "You disappear during a crucial week, delegate major decisions to subordinates, and you expect me to maintain my confidence in your ability to manage my investment." James, exhausted by the emotional roller coaster of recent days, struggled to maintain his professional mask. "Exceptional family circumstances required my presence," he explained, knowing perfectly well that this excuse would sound hollow to a man like Marshall. "Family," repeated the investor with a smirk. "That's exactly what I feared. The James Wilson I know would never have placed personal considerations above his professional responsibilities." This remark hit James harder than he would have thought possible. It was precisely the reputation he had forged over the years, that of a ruthless businessman for whom nothing came before work, a reputation that had earned him the respect of his peers and the trust of investors, but had also cost him any chance of genuine human connection. "People change," he said softly, surprising Marshall with this moment of unexpected honesty. "Not in our world," the investor dryly replied. "Listen, Wilson, I'll be frank. Either you pull yourself together and become the man I bet on again, or I withdraw my $50 million and invest it with Harris." The threat was clear, and the choice presented to James crueler than he would have imagined a few days earlier. Before Emily, the decision would have been obvious: work above all. But now— "I need your answer now," insisted Marshall, ostentatiously consulting his watch. "I'm taking a plane to Geneva in an hour." James looked out the window, toward New York progressively lighting up. Somewhere in that city, Emily was waiting for him at the family mansion. Emily, who had shown him in a few days a different way of existing in the world, with authenticity, with vulnerability. "Take all the time you want to decide," he finally told Marshall, rising to signal that the meeting was over. "But know that if your confidence in me depends on my ability to sacrifice my humanity, then perhaps we should indeed reconsider our collaboration." Marshall stared at him, astonished by this unexpected reversal. "Are you serious? You're risking the project of your life for—" "What exactly?" James smiled, a sincere smile that bore no resemblance to the calculated grimace he usually reserved for negotiations. "For the possibility of simply living." Once Marshall had left, promising to seriously reconsider the future of their collaboration. James collapsed into his chair. Had he just sabotaged years of relentless work, put in jeopardy the family legacy he had sworn to preserve? And yet, strangely, he felt lighter than he had been in years. His phone vibrated, displaying a message from Sarah. "Where are you? Mother is worried. Emily, too." Emily. Her name now provoked a physical reaction in him, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. What would he tell her when seeing her again? How would he explain that these 10 days had upended all his certainties? As he prepared to leave his office, his gaze fell on the Hamptons Shore project plans spread out on his conference table. A luxury real estate complex that would replace a historic district in the Hamptons. Years earlier, he would have been proud of it. Today, he saw only an architectural aberration, devoid of soul and consideration for the heritage it would destroy. In an impulsive gesture, he grabbed the plans and carefully rolled them up. An idea was taking shape in his mind, crazy, risky, but potentially liberating. Meanwhile, at the Wilson mansion, Emily was helping Elizabeth finalize the floral arrangements for the grand party planned for the next day. The two women worked in silence, but a comfortable silence, as if the previous day's confession had established a form of tacit complicity between them. "He's like his grandfather," Elizabeth suddenly said, placing a white rose at the center of an arrangement. Stubborn, brilliant, and terribly afraid of his own feelings. Emily looked up, surprised by this remark that echoed Margaret's revelations. "You knew? About William and my grandmother?" Elizabeth had an enigmatic smile. "Families keep secrets, my dear, but women talk to each other. William confessed this story to my mother-in-law on his deathbed. She in turn told me." She arranged some foliage before continuing. "When James first spoke to me about you, I was intrigued by your name. Parker, I wondered if it was a coincidence or destiny," completed Emily, recalling the conversation on Brooklyn Bridge. "Call it what you will," replied Elizabeth. "I prefer to see it as a second chance, an opportunity to rectify a past mistake." Before Emily could respond, the salon door opened abruptly on Sarah, her face tense. "James just called. He has a problem at the office and won't be able to get away tonight." Emily felt her heart tighten. After the emotional intensity of their hospital visit, this sudden withdrawal into the business world seemed revealing. Perhaps James already regretted the confidences shared, the feelings glimpsed. "I see," she said, struggling to mask her disappointment. Elizabeth placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Don't jump to conclusions, dear. My son has spent years building walls around his heart. He won't tear them down in one night." These words, though kind, only accentuated the doubt growing in Emily. In 2 days, the agreed-upon 10 days, would be over. What would remain then? A strange experience to recount, a bittersweet memory of a life she had briefly brushed against, without being able to grasp. "I think I'll retire," she said softly. "The day has been long." In her room, Emily contemplated the designer dress hanging in the wardrobe, the one she was supposed to wear the next day for Elizabeth's grand birthday celebration. A garment that represented everything that separated her from the Wilson world. Even if James truly felt something for her, how could she fit into this universe of opulence and rigid social conventions? She approached the window, observing the garden plunged into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of Greenwich Village faintly glimmered. Her neighborhood, her world, her reality. For the first time since the beginning of this adventure, Emily wondered if she shouldn't have refused James's proposition that morning in the bakery. For the pain of losing something one has never truly possessed is sometimes crueler than that of never having known it. At that precise moment, the fracture separating their two worlds seemed more insurmountable than ever. A fracture that, like the one that had separated her grandmother and William Wilson decades earlier, threatened to consume a nascent love in the implacable flames of social conventions and family expectations. Night had wrapped New York in its inky mantle when James finally crossed the gates of the family mansion. Silence reigned in the sleeping home, all guests having retired to prepare for the grand party the next day. Only a faint light filtered from beneath the door of the small parlor. James headed there, expecting to find his mother, who often suffered from insomnia. To his surprise, it was Emily, he discovered, curled up in an armchair near the window, an ancient book abandoned on her knees. She looked up at his entrance, and in that gaze, James read a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper so as not to disturb the nocturnal calm. James approached, loosening his tie with a weary gesture. "I had to handle a complex situation at the office." "More important than everything else?" asked Emily, a touch of bitterness showing despite herself. He sat across from her, suddenly aware of the distance that had settled between them during these few hours of separation, a distance that seemed to reverse all the intimacy they had built. "That's what I've always believed," he admitted, "that nothing was more important than work, than the company, than the legacy to preserve." He paused, searching for his words. "But today, facing an investor who threatened to withdraw everything if I didn't return to being the James Wilson of before, the one who sacrificed everything on the altar of professional success, I realized something." "What?" asked Emily, her gaze suddenly attentive. "That I no longer want to be that man," he answered simply. "That the person I was before meeting you now seems incomplete to me." The confession, uttered in the intimacy of this New York night, floated between them like a fragile promise. "I did something today," continued James, pulling from his briefcase a roll of plans that he spread on the coffee table. "Something I would never have imagined doing 10 days ago." Emily leaned in to examine the documents, architectural plans modified by hand, with annotations carefully written in the margin. "What is this?" "The Hamptons Shore Project, our biggest investment of the year. A luxury real estate complex that was to replace a historic district in the Hamptons." "Was to," noted Emily. James smiled, a smile tinged with both pride and worry. "I spent the afternoon completely rethinking it. Instead of demolishing the existing heritage, we're going to restore it, integrate it into a more respectful, more human vision of urban planning." He pointed to the sketches he had added: green spaces, walkways connecting the old and the new, community areas open to all. "It's magnificent," murmured Emily, genuinely impressed. "But your investor—" "He might leave, yes," admitted James, "which would mean millions lost and perhaps my position within the company." Emily looked at him with a new concern. Why risk all that? James took a deep breath as if preparing to plunge into unknown waters. "Because these 10 days with you have shown me another way of existing in the world, a way that privileges authenticity rather than appearances, human connections rather than financial transactions." He moved closer to her, daring to take her hands in his. "I've spent my life trying to correspond to an image, that of the perfect heir, the flawless businessman. I've repressed my true desires to conform to others' expectations, and then you walked into my bakery with your flour-stained apron and your disarming frankness." Emily felt her heart accelerate, suspended on the words of this man who, day after day, had revealed himself so different from her first impression. "I don't know what will happen tomorrow," continued James, his voice both firm and vulnerable. "I don't know if my project will be accepted, if my career will survive this turn. But I know one thing with certainty. I don't want these 10 days to end. I don't want to return to my life before, a life where you didn't exist." The silence that followed this declaration was charged with unexpressed emotions, with dizzying possibilities. "And the agreement?" Emily finally asked, her voice barely audible. "The $50,000 for 10 days of presence at your side?" James shook his head, as if this contractual reality now belonged to a distant past. "This agreement no longer makes any sense. What happened between us has surpassed any financial transaction. The only question that matters now is, what do you want, Emily? Not for 10 days, but for the days that will follow." The question resonated in the silent room, calling for an answer that Emily wasn't certain she could formulate. For despite James's evident sincerity, despite the feelings she herself could no longer deny, a fear persisted, that of not belonging to this world, of always being the outsider, the Greenwich Village baker, playing a role that wasn't hers. "I'm afraid," she finally admitted, her voice betraying her emotion. "Afraid that what we feel is just an illusion, created by this extraordinary situation. Afraid of waking up in a month and realizing that our worlds are too different to truly meet." James listened attentively, his face reflecting a deep understanding of her doubts. "Emily, look around you," he said softly. "This mansion, this antique furniture, this lifestyle, this isn't me. It's the legacy I accepted out of duty. But the man who redesigned these plans tonight, the man who chose to risk his career to be true to himself, that's who I aspire to become. And that man doesn't belong to this world any more than you do." He stood, inviting her to follow him to the window that overlooked the garden bathed in moonlight. "We could create our own world," he murmured. "One that would be neither yours nor mine, but something new built together." The proposal, as simple as it was revolutionary, resonated with Emily as a possibility she had never dared to consider. A third way, beyond the dichotomies that had seemed to separate them. "There would be so many obstacles," she said, though her voice betrayed a new hesitation, a nascent hope. "Without doubt," James agreed. "But for the first time in my life, I believe some things are worth fighting for." In the complicit darkness of this New York parlor, their gazes locked, bearing a tacit promise. Then, in a gesture of new intimacy, James gently brushed Emily's cheek, a light touch that said more than all the words in the world. "Tomorrow is the big day," he finally said. "The party, the official end of our arrangement. Whatever happens, know that these 10 days have changed my life in a way I could never have anticipated." Emily nodded, unable to articulate the storm of emotions swirling within her. As they separated to return to their respective rooms, she felt that something irreversible had just occurred. Not a formal commitment, but a mutual recognition of possibilities that neither would have imagined 10 days earlier. That night, lying in her bed, Emily thought back on the path traveled since that ordinary morning in her bakery. In accepting James's absurd proposal, she had sought financial security, a practical solution to concrete problems. What she had found, however, was far more precious and infinitely more frightening. The possibility of rewriting her story, of embracing dreams she had thought forever lost. The question that kept her awake until the first light of dawn was no longer that of the end of their agreement, but that of the beginning of something entirely new, a chapter of which no one, not even they, could predict the outcome. The Wilson mansion gleamed under the starry New York sky. Hundreds of lanterns suspended in the garden trees created a fairy tale atmosphere, while the notes of a string quartet floated in the perfumed late summer air. The guests, elegantly dressed, circulated between sumptuous buffets and liveried servers, celebrating Elizabeth Wilson's 75th birthday with all the pomp her status demanded. Emily, in a sapphire-colored dress chosen by Sarah, who had revealed herself to be a surprising ally in recent days, observed this luxurious world with a new detachment. The day before, she would have felt like an intruder, an actress playing a role that wasn't hers. But the revelations of the previous night had changed her perspective. It was no longer a question of belonging to one world or another, but of choice, the choice to be authentically herself, whatever the setting. "You're radiant," said a voice behind her. James advanced to her side, elegant in his black tuxedo. Their proximity drew a few curious glances among the guests, for despite the official introductions, many were still surprised to see the Wilson heir, known for his reserve, so visibly taken with a stranger. "Your mother seems happy," Emily noted, indicating Elizabeth, who was receiving the homage of her guests with a regal grace. "She is," James confirmed. "Not only because of this party, but because she sincerely believes she has obtained what she desired most, seeing me finally open my heart to someone." A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated by the animated conversations of the guests and the delicate notes of the cello. "Have you made your decision?" James finally asked, his gaze seeking Emily's. "Concerning us." Before she could answer, a commotion drew their attention. Robert Wilson, James's cousin, visibly tipsy, approached them with an unsteady but determined step. "So, James," he launched loud enough to attract the attention of nearby guests, "I heard you completely redesigned the Hampton Shore project. Marshall is furious. He's threatening to withdraw all his financing." An embarrassed silence fell over the neighboring groups. James imperceptibly stiffened, but his face remained impassive. "This is neither the time nor the place to discuss business, Robert," he calmly replied. "On the contrary," insisted the cousin, emboldened by alcohol, "when the flagship of the family business is sinking, it's precisely the time to talk about it, especially when the cause of this shipwreck seems to be—" His gaze ostentatiously slid toward Emily, an unexpected distraction. Emily felt her heart tighten. This was exactly what she feared, being perceived as an obstacle, as the one who had diverted James from his responsibilities. To her great surprise, it was Sarah who intervened, advancing with the assurance of a lioness protecting her own. "You should rest, Robert. You've clearly had too much to drink," she said dryly before turning to a server. "Could you escort my cousin to his room?" Robert wanted to protest, but Sarah's icy gaze dissuaded him. He moved away, but not without casting a final venomous look at Emily. "I'm sorry," she murmured to James once the cousin had left. "I didn't want to cause problems in your business." James shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "You haven't caused anything. Robert is right on one point. Marshall is indeed threatening to withdraw, but his decision has nothing to do with you. It's due to the modifications I made to the project. Modifications I should have made long ago, well before knowing you." He gently took her hand, a gesture that drew a few curious glances, but which he seemed not to notice. "Emily, I realize I've placed you in an impossible position. By asking you to enter my life, even temporarily, I've disrupted yours, and now I'm asking you to consider a future together, while my own professional future is more uncertain than ever." He paused, searching for the right words. "It would be selfish of me to expect you to make a decision now. I understand that you need time, distance perhaps, to clearly see what you truly desire." Emily was touched by this unexpected consideration. The man standing before her was so different from the one who had entered her bakery 10 days earlier. More vulnerable, more authentic, more aware of the impact of his actions on others. "I don't know what I want," she softly admitted, "but I know what I don't want. I don't want to be the reason for your estrangement from your family or your company. I don't want to be perceived as the one who diverted you from your path. And if that path wasn't mine," James replied with quiet conviction, "and if by showing me another way of being in the world, you had simply helped me find my true way." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elizabeth, resplendent in her burgundy evening gown, accompanied by a man in his 60s with a keen gaze and undeniable bearing. "James, Emily," she said with a warm smile, "allow me to introduce you to David Thompson, an old friend, and also one of the most respected architects in New York." The introductions were made, and Emily noted with surprise James's sudden interest in this man, whom he evidently knew by reputation. "Your mother told me about your project in the Hamptons," said Thompson without preamble. "The idea of restoring rather than demolishing, of integrating the old into the new. It's exactly the philosophy I've been defending for years." James seemed momentarily destabilized. "My mother told you about this?" Elizabeth had an enigmatic smile. "Walls have ears in this house, my son, and a mother always knows what preoccupies her children." She turned to Emily, taking her arm affectionately. "Dear, would you grant me a few minutes? I'd like to show you something before the toast." Emily nodded, not without casting a questioning glance at James, who seemed as surprised as she was by this request. Elizabeth led her through the crowd of guests to a small greenhouse attached to the mansion, an oasis of greenery isolated from the noise of the party. There, under the dim light of lamps placed among exotic plants, waited Margaret, seated in a wheelchair, but with a lively eye and a radiant smile. "Grandma!" exclaimed Emily, rushing to her. "What are you doing here? You should be in the hospital." "The doctors accepted an exceptional outing," explained Margaret, embracing her granddaughter. "Mrs. Wilson arranged everything. The ambulance, the nurse accompanying me, everything." Emily turned to Elizabeth, astonished by this extraordinary attention. "Why?" she asked simply. Elizabeth's face softened, momentarily losing the mask of social perfection she wore for her guests. "Because I understood that this party wasn't just the celebration of my 75 years, but also that of a new beginning, and new beginnings should always include those we love." She approached Margaret, and in this improbable tableau, the grand lady of New York high society and the modest retired baker, Emily glimpsed a connection that transcended social classes and appearances. "Margaret and I have spoken a lot on the phone in recent days," Elizabeth revealed. "We discovered that we shared more than the love for our grandchildren. We also share the hope of seeing them happy, even if this happiness doesn't correspond to the paths we had imagined for them." Emily felt emotion overwhelm her in the face of this unexpected alliance between the two matriarchs. "James has changed since he met you," continued Elizabeth. "For the first time since his father's death, I see my son truly alive, authentically himself. This miracle I owe to you." "I haven't done anything extraordinary," Emily protested. "On the contrary," Margaret intervened. "You showed him that it was possible to be true to oneself while respecting one's roots. That's the most precious lesson there is." An emotion-laden silence settled in the small greenhouse, punctuated only by the distant echoes of music and conversations. "Emily," Elizabeth finally resumed, "whatever you decide regarding your future with my son, know that you will always have a place in this family, not as a guest or a stranger, but as someone who has reminded this house of the true meaning of authenticity." These words, uttered with undeniable sincerity, touched Emily to the core of her being. For the first time since the beginning of this improbable adventure, she felt that her presence in this world wasn't an imposture or an anomaly, but perhaps exactly what this world needed: a breath of freshness and authenticity in a universe too often governed by appearances. As she prepared to rejoin the party on Elizabeth's arm, her grandmother took her hand, gently whispering, "Don't be afraid of your happiness, my Emily. True love doesn't present itself often in a lifetime. When it does, one must have the courage to seize it, even if it leads us onto unexpected paths." These words resonated with Emily like a blessing, giving her the strength to face the choices that awaited her, choices that no longer concerned just 10 days of charade, but potentially the rest of her life. Dawn was rising over New York, bathing the city in a nascent light that progressively erased the last shadows of the night. In the garden of the Wilson mansion, deserted after the previous evening's festivities, Emily sat on a stone bench, contemplating the spectacle of the first rays of sun caressing the New York rooftops. The last guests had departed a few hours earlier, and now a strange calm reigned over the property, as if the home itself was catching its breath after the excitement of the grand party. Emily hadn't managed to sleep, too many thoughts swirling in her mind. Today officially marked the 10th day of their arrangement, the end of the contract that had brought her to this house. The slight crunching of footsteps on gravel made her look up. James was approaching, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. He had changed after the party, abandoning his tuxedo for simple jeans and a grey sweater, an outfit that made him strangely more accessible, more real. "I thought you might be here," he said softly, offering her a cup which she accepted with gratitude. "You couldn't sleep either." Emily shook her head, savouring the warmth of the coffee between her hands. "Too much to think about." James sat beside her, respecting the space between them, neither too close nor too distant. "The party was beautiful," Emily commented after a moment of shared silence. "Your mother seemed truly happy." "She was," James confirmed. "Not only because of the celebration, but also because she sensed something changing in this house, in this family." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "Thompson contacted me this morning. He's interested in a collaboration on the Hamptons Shore project. With his name and reputation, we might convince the investors of the viability of the new approach." Emily smiled, genuinely happy for him. "That's wonderful, James. You could realize your dream of architecture while preserving the family legacy." "It won't be easy," he tempered. "Marshall is still reluctant, and the board will have their say. But for the first time in a long time, I feel I'm on the right path. My path, not the one traced for me." He turned to her, his gaze suddenly more intense. "Emily, I know our arrangement ends today. I also know I have no right to ask anything more of you. These 10 days have been extraordinary, but they unfolded in circumstances that are nothing like normal." He took a deep breath as if gathering all his courage. "That's why I wanted to tell you that I would perfectly understand if you chose to return to your life before, to resume your bakery, to take care of your grandmother, to follow your own path without the complications my presence would inevitably bring." Emily listened attentively, touched by this consideration that placed her needs and desires before his own. "But before you make your decision," he continued, "I'd like to show you something." He took from his pocket a small key which he handed to her. "What is this?" she asked, intrigued. "The key to a commercial space in Soho, a place I acquired a few years ago as an investment, but which I never really knew how to use." Emily took the key, confused. "I don't understand." "This space could become a bakery pastry shop," explained James. "Not just any, yours. A place where you could develop the talents your grandmother revealed to me, create the pastries you've always dreamed of, write perhaps in quiet moments." He broke off, suddenly uncertain in the face of her silence. "It's not a gift, Emily. Hey, it's a business proposition. You would be the majority owner. I would only be a silent investor. Your independence would be totally preserved." Emily looked at the key in her palm, feeling the weight of what it represented, not a gilded cage or an attempt to buy her, but a recognition of her aspirations, a means to realize dreams she had long buried beneath everyday necessities. "And us?" she finally asked, raising her eyes to him. "What is your proposal for us, James?" He seemed momentarily surprised by this direct question, then an authentic smile illuminated his face. "My proposal for us is much simpler and infinitely more complex," he said softly. "I propose that we take time, that we learn to know each other in the real world, not in this bubble we created for 10 days. That we discover if what we feel can flourish in everyday life, in the sometimes necessary banality of ordinary life." He gently took her hand, enclosing the key in their intertwined fingers. "I'm not asking you to give me your answer now. I'm only asking you to think about it, to consider the possibilities." Emily felt a powerful emotion rise within her, not the feverish excitement of first infatuations, but something deeper, more lasting, a recognition of finding herself at a decisive crossroads in her life. "I've already thought about it, James," she said softly, "all night, in fact." She took a deep breath, ready to share the conclusion of her nocturnal reflections. "These 10 days have been like a dream, a beautiful dream certainly, but detached from reality. We played roles, even if our emotions became authentic over time. To know if what we feel can truly flourish, we need to anchor ourselves in the real." James nodded, his face reflecting both hope and apprehension. "That's why," Emily continued, "I'll accept this key, not as a promise between us, but as a symbol of new possibilities for myself. I'll create this bakery, not to please you or to stay close to you, but because it's a dream I had abandoned and that you helped me rediscover." She gently squeezed his hand. wanting him to understand the important nuance of her decision. As for us, I propose that we start over from the beginning, not as a businessman and a baker hired to play a role, but as two people who truly discover each other. Without contract, without deadline, without preconceived expectations. James's face lit up with a joy he didn't try to hide. That seems to me the wisest of decisions, he said, bringing her hand to his lips in a gesture imbued with respect and affection. They remained thus for a moment, side by side on this stone bench, watching the sun continue its ascent in the New York sky. A new day was rising, literally and metaphorically, the first of a story they would write together, no longer constrained by a commercial agreement or family expectations, but guided by the authentic impulses of their hearts. It was in this moment of shared calm that Emily realized a fundamental truth. Sometimes the most beautiful life paths are not those we carefully plan, but those that emerge from the most unexpected detours. 6 months later, snow was falling gently on New York, transforming the city into a winter tableau where the lights of street lamps created golden halos in the white mist. On the window of a bakery in Soho, golden letters proudly announced, "Emily's Delights." Inside, the establishment buzzed with joyful activity. Customers from all walks of life crowded to buy the creations that had rapidly made this new place famous. Pastries that married American tradition and touches of originality, inspired by the owner's travels and readings. Emily, her cheeks flushed by the heat of the ovens, arranged a new batch of almond croissants on the display. Her hands, still marked by work, testified to a labor now chosen rather than endured. Her gaze, once preoccupied with daily worries, now shone with quiet satisfaction. The doorbell chimed, announcing the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Elizabeth Wilson, elegant despite the cold in her cashmere coat, approached the counter, accompanied by Sarah. "Elizabeth, Sarah, what a surprise!" exclaimed Emily, coming around the counter to warmly welcome them. "We were passing by," Elizabeth explained with a smile that belied the fortuitous nature of this visit. "And the smell of your wonders attracted us like a magnet." Emily invited them to sit at a small table near the window, bringing them hot chocolates and a selection of her best pastries. "How is Margaret?" Elizabeth inquired with sincere solicitude. "Wonderfully well," Emily replied. "Her rehabilitation ended last month and she's resumed her painting classes. She often speaks of your last lunch together." A complicit smile passed between the two women, evoking the improbable friendship that had developed between the two grandmothers, transcending the social differences that might have separated them. "And my son?" Elizabeth finally asked, a mischievous light in her gaze. "I see him so rarely these days, absorbed as he is in this famous Hamptons project." Emily smiled, aware of Elizabeth's barely veiled attempt to probe the evolution of their relationship. "James works a lot," she admitted. "The collaboration with Mr. Thompson is demanding, but so enriching for him. I've never seen him so professionally fulfilled." "And personally," Sarah intervened with a frankness that characterized her. Emily blushed slightly. "We're taking our time, as agreed. We're discovering each other in real life, with its ups and downs, its extraordinary moments and its routines." "And?" Sarah insisted, ignoring her mother's reproachful look. "And it's more real than anything I've known," Emily replied with disarming simplicity. "More difficult sometimes, but infinitely more precious." The conversation veered toward other subjects, the latest family gossip, Sarah's projects who had decided to reorient her legal career toward environmental law, the preparations for the end-of-year holidays. A precious normality had settled between these women, whom everything should have separated, but whom circumstances had united. After Elizabeth and Sarah's departure, Emily returned to her ovens, preparing the last batches before closing. The snow was intensifying outside, creating a muffled atmosphere that invited contemplation. She thought back on the extraordinary events that had led her here, an improbable commercial arrangement that had upended her life in a way she could never have anticipated. The bell chimed again. James appeared on the threshold, his hair and shoulders sprinkled with snow, a small package under his arm. "You're early," Emily noted with a smile, approaching to kiss him lightly. Their relationship had evolved naturally, without rush. They saw each other regularly, learning to know each other in everyday life, delightfully discovering the facets of their personalities that the artificial situation of the 10 days hadn't revealed. They didn't live together, preserving their respective spaces while progressively creating a common universe. "I finished earlier," James explained, shaking the snow from his coat, "and I had something to show you." He unfolded on the counter what turned out to be architectural plans, those of the Hamptons Shore project, now considerably modified and enriched. "The board approved the final version this morning," he announced, an evident pride in his voice. "We're starting work in the spring." Emily examined the plans attentively, admiring the way James had managed to integrate heritage preservation into a resolutely modern and ecological vision. "It's magnificent," she said sincerely. "You must be so proud." "I am," he admitted, "but not only of the project." He looked at her intensely, his eyes expressing a deep emotion. "I'm proud of the path traveled. 6 months ago, I was a man who had forgotten his dreams, who lived according to others' expectations. Today, she gently encouraged, today, I'm simply myself, and that's the greatest freedom I've ever known." Emily placed her hand on his, perfectly understanding this feeling. For she too had found a form of liberation, not in the financial comfort that the initial agreement had provided her, but in the rediscovery of her own aspirations, in the permission she had finally granted herself to pursue her dreams. "I have something for you too," she said, disappearing into the back of the shop to return with a small package. James opened it with curiosity, discovering a leather-bound notebook filled with elegant writing. "These are my stories," Emily explained, suddenly shy. "The ones I write in the morning before opening the shop. You're the first to read them." This gesture, simple in appearance, represented an immense trust, the sharing of a part of herself she had long kept secret. James leafed through the notebook with reverence, understanding the value of the gift she was offering him. "Thank you," he said simply, but his gaze expressed much more than this word could contain. They closed the shop together, turning off the lights one by one, leaving only the Christmas garlands to softly illuminate the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming New York into a realm of white silence. Walking hand in hand toward the small restaurant where they had planned to dine, they resembled in no way the improbable couple they had formed 6 months earlier, the cold air and the shy baker bound by a contract. They were simply two people who had found, through the most unexpected detours, the courage to be authentically themselves and to love with sincerity. At the crossing of a small square, where a street pianist played a nostalgic melody despite the cold, James suddenly stopped, drawing Emily into a spontaneous embrace. "You know," he murmured against her hair, "I never really paid the $50,000 of our initial agreement." Emily laughed softly. "You paid for my grandmother's operation, renovated her house, and invested in my bakery. I think the account is more than settled." "That's not what I mean," he replied with a sudden seriousness. "Our agreement specified $50,000 for 10 days of pretending to be my fiancé, but in the end you didn't pretend. You were authentically yourself, and that's what changed everything." He took her face between his hands with infinite tenderness. "I owe you much more than money, Emily Parker. I owe you the rediscovery of myself, and for that I will spend the rest of my life trying to repay you." Under the flakes dancing around them, illuminated by the lights of the square, they kissed, not as the conclusion of a fairy tale, but as the promise of a very real story that was just beginning. A story founded not on a 10-day contract, but on the daily discovery of love in its most authentic manifestations. For sometimes the most improbable arrangements open the way to the deepest truths, and in this snow-covered New York, two souls had found, through the twists of destiny, the path to themselves and to each other. Miracles do not reside in fairy tales, but in the courage to reinvent one's life at the moment when one least expects it.